Bum bum. Doof 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 doof.
Red Bull. Hello there and welcome to Go Any Last Words, a podcast for Air Cadets. That's Sergeant White.
And that's me.
And Sergeant White, what are we talking about today?
So we're continuing the 8,000ers series, I'm going to call it.
8,000ers? Okay.
8,000ers, because there are 14 mountains in the world that are 8,000 meters tall. Hence the 8,000ers. So these are mountains that are considered the most, the greatest feats of human expedition. Last time, we talked about Mount Everest. This week, we'll talk about the second highest mountain in the world. Do you know what that is?
Is it... I'm trying to think. Is it K2?
Great acting. Yes. So this week, we're talking about K2.
Okay, brilliant.
So as I've said, K2 is the second highest mountain in the world after Mount Everest, which, if you remember, is how many meters?
8,848 kilometers high.
I'm going to have to ask you to think about the unit of measurement you've just said.
8,848 meters high.
I think 8,000 kilometers might be the equivalent to here to the moon.
Maybe that's what I was thinking. I've got moon on the brain.
Yeah.
8,848 meters high.
Yeah. And K2
right
is 8,611 meters tall.
Okay. I've never heard of K2 before today.
Well, get educated and let's learn about K2.
I'm excited. Bring it on.
K2 is situated on the China-Pakistan border. K2 is the highest point of the Karakoram mountain range. Now, do you know why K2 is called K2?
Is there a K1?
It's just called K2 because it's Karakoram
Karam
2. Yeah, so that's where the K comes from, if you're wondering. It's not something like Cool Droid or something like that. It's just, yeah.
That's a shame.
So, and it is also the highest point in Pakistan.
Okay.
Yeah. So, K2 became popularly known as the Savage Mountain after George Bell, who was a climber on the 1953 expedition, told reporters it's a savage mountain that tries to kill you. So if that isn't enticing...
Hashtag savage.
Yeah. It's a mountain that tries to kill you. So if that doesn't make you want to go up it, I don't know what will. So it's one of the 5 highest mountains in the world, as we know. It's the second tallest. But it is the deadliest out of all of the mountains.
More deadly than Everest.
More deadly than Everest.
Because see, Everest has all the myth and sort of background around, sort of the bodies that are found on Everest. It's what
because
people
Everest
talk
is
about.
the tallest. Like we said in one of the previous episodes about the moon, everyone just wants to be first. Everyone wants what's number one. People want to climb Everest because you can say you've climbed the highest mountain in the world. It's not the most difficult mountain to climb. People don't care about that. They want to be the tallest.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the most deadly mountain to climb in the world. Approximately 1 person dies on the mountain for every 4 people that reach the summit.
So 25% of the expeditions that happen end in fatalities, would you say?
So
Or
only
25% of the people who go on expeditions in K2 die?
No. 1 person dies on average for every 4 people that reach the summit.
Okay.
So the summit to death ratio is 1 to 4. People go there and safely get halfway up the main mountain and come back down again.
Okay.
It's just summit to death. So complete success to complete tragedy is 1 to 4, basically.
Right. Wow.
The summit was reached for the first time by 2 Italian climbers, Lino Laccidelli and Achille Compagnoni, on the 1954 Italian expedition. And
1954?
And we'll talk more about that later on. So K2 is the only 8,000er that hasn't been climbed from its eastern face. So all the other 8,000ers have been climbed from the north face, south face, east face, west face. This is the only mountain that hasn't been climbed from its eastern face.
Is that because it's extremely dangerous?
Because it's extremely dangerous. So the ascents have always been made in July to August because these are typically the warmest times of year to do it. And obviously warmth generally means safety when you're working in an area where winter is horrifically cold, like minus 40. So K2's more northern location makes it more susceptible to inclement weather and colder weather. So we're talking about like the Pakistani border here, so of course it's going to be cold. Altitude makes things cold as well.
Yeah.
So that's one of the factors that makes it more dangerous.
Yeah.
So although the summit of Everest is at a higher altitude, we've already said K2 is much more difficult to climb.
Mm-hmm.
So as of June 2018, only 367 people have completed the ascent to the summit. There have been 86 deaths during the attempted climbs.
Wow. Do you know how many people have climbed Everest?
A lot.
A lot more than that, would you say?
A lot more than that. A lot more than that. Everest is very commercialized now. Like we said in the Everest episode, you can get an assisted helicopter ride halfway up.
Yeah.
And back down again.
Yeah.
So back to the first successful climb.
Mm-hmm.
So in the 1954 Italian expedition, they make it to the summit of K2. They use what's called the Abruzzi Spur, which is one of these routes that's been mapped out over multiple attempts of people climbing it, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So the team included a Pakistani member named Colonel Mohammed Alatollah, who had been part of the 1953 American expedition. So he tried this the year before and had come back to try and help them again.
Because the American one, I'm assuming, in 1953 was unsuccessful because they didn't reach the summit.
No, they did not. So also on the expedition were Walter Bonatti and a Pakistani porter called Amir Mehdi, who both proved vital in the expedition's success. So what they did is they carried oxygen tanks to the 8,100 meter mark. This so that the two Italian men we talked about before, Lacidelli and Compagnoni, could continue their way up their ascent. But there was controversy. Right. So, Lacidelli and Compagnoni established their camp at a higher elevation than had originally been agreed with Mehdi and Bonatti.
Okay.
So basically, they said, we'll meet you at the, we'll call it 7,800 meter mark.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't. They put their camp higher, knowing that they wouldn't be able to reach them. So with it being too dark, they decided that they were just going to have to sleep where they were. So Mehdi and Bonatti were forced to, overnight, without any shelter, camp above the 8,000 meters. And you know what they call anything above 8,000 meters, don't you?
The death zone.
The death zone. So because of Compagnoni and the other Italian climbers' decision to move the camp further up, they willingly left them out overnight in the cold.
Did they just do that because they wanted to sort of get a leg up and be a bit ahead?
No. So basically what they did was they said, right, you're going to have to sleep here. Well, they didn't have a choice. They couldn't go up and they couldn't come down because it was complete nightfall and you're in the death zone on one of them, literally the world's hardest mountain to climb. So they said they heard a shout. So they were shouting out their names trying to find them because obviously they thought, oh, maybe it's just the weather that we can't see them. So they're shouting out. And Lacidelli shouts down and says, you just leave the oxygen. We've waited too long for you guys. You're going to have to head down without us. So they just left the oxygen. And they descended. Basically.
Right.
So they both survived the night in the death zone.
Yeah.
But Mehdi was hospitalized for months and had to have his toes amputated because of the frostbite.
God.
Yeah. So efforts in the 1950s to suppress these facts and to protect Lacidelli and Compagnoni's reputations, because at this point they were Italian national heroes. They were the first people to ever climb K2.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, they're going to try and squash any claims of controversy as to the fact that they left two men freezing on the side of the mountain because they purposely and intentionally moved their camp further up. So it was later revealed that they moved the camp deliberately because Compagnoni feared that Bonatti was going to outshine him by summiting with him. So basically, Bonatti and the Pakistani, Mehdi, they had both attempted to climb the mountain before, but they'd been unsuccessful. So they had an agreement with Compagnoni and Lacidelli that if they were strong enough, they would be allowed to continue up the mountain with them to summit. They'd already carried their oxygen up for them. They were said, if we're not going to be a burden to you, will you let us continue up the mountain? And they'd said yes. So obviously they were bringing the oxygen up to meet them at their camp, and then providing they were strong enough, they were all going to walk up together. Mm-hmm. Or at least that was what was happening in Bonatti's mind. But what Compagnoni decided was to pitch the camp further up so that the limelight wouldn't be stolen.
Was it just Compagnoni that...
Well, obviously Lacedelli was in on it as well, because otherwise he'd be like, well, where are they?
God.
So yeah, a bit
Purely
mean.
selfish reasons.
Very, very selfish. To leave someone out in the death zone just through fear of having your achievement undermined. They could have been the first group of 4 to summit, but no, they wanted it to be a solo.
They wanted their name in lights.
He wanted to be the youngest one because Compagnoni was younger than Lacedelli.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's that controversy out of the way.
Mm-hmm.
So about 20-ish years later, on the 9th of August 1977, 23 years after the Italian expedition, Yoshizawa led the second successful expedition. So he led this expedition and he took the first native Pakistani climber up with him as well, and they both ascended. So the Japanese expedition took the Aberystwyth Spur, the same one they took the time that they actually successfully ascended, and they used more than 1,500 porters to get there.
Wow.
So when I first read that, I thought, how do you need that many porters? Then I watched a documentary on it, and I can see how they could have used that many porters.
Mm-hmm.
So it takes 3 months to trek to the base of this mountain. 3 months.
Just to the base.
Just to the base. So, and then once you get to the base, you stay there for about a month before you climb. So that's like 4 months. So
Why do you stay there for so long?
Because you have to acclimatize and you have to get everything ready. Like it's not like a adventure course. There's no like ropes stuck on the mountain for you. You have to go up and do everything yourself. Like it's not like it's maintained throughout the year. There's no one there for 9 months of the year. You have to walk everything you need for 4 months from this one place.
Yeah.
So those 1,500 porters will have been carrying 4 months worth of supplies. They also cook for them. They set up the tents. They do everything for the climbers until they start to ascend.
Right. Okay.
Even when they do ascend, some porters will go up with them to keep them safe.
Right.
But basically, it's like you're carrying 3 or 4 months worth of food, shelter, everything
Of your life.
for 3 months just to get to the bottom of this mountain.
Wow.
And one person can only carry so much.
Yeah.
Like, one person could just carry 3 months worth of pasta or whatever. And then you've got to think, you've got to have medical supplies and oxygen and everything.
Are these 1,500 porters all employed at different times?
Well, I presume they're all set off at the same time. Because
That's
otherwise, where are they
crazy.
coming from? They're not just going to crawl out the mountain
That is
halfway
so
down.
crazy.
Yeah. But you do see it. I mean, now they utilise more like camels and cattle.
Yeah.
This was back in the day.
Surely that
before
must
it
have
was-
cost a lot of money as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is a poorer part of the world at this point. So obviously Western money can influence it highly if you're not paying people
Yeah.
amazingly. So the third ascent was in 1978 via a new route. So this was the Northeast Ridge. So what they did is the top route traversed along the east face to avoid a vertical wall and then joined up with the Aberystwyth route at the top because there wasn't really any other way to get there. So this ascent was made by an American team led by James Whittaker. The summiting party was Lewitt Redhart, Jim Wickwire, John Roskelley, and Rick Ridgway. So Wickwire endured an overnight bivouac. And you know what a bivouac is?
It's basically just like a makeshift,
It's just
easy shelter, like a
it's
big,
like- it's
big
like-
sheet.
It's necessarily not even a shelter.
Yeah.
It's just survive. It's just basically sitting and sleeping outside in these cases
Yeah.
because they're not carrying sheets up with them. They're not carrying emergency shelters up with them because you just do not have the energy. So he had an overnight about 150 meters below the summit, and this is one of the highest bivouacs in recorded history. So he survived 150 meters
That is
from
crazy
the summit.
that he survived that.
Yeah.
Mad.
Yeah. So this ascent was very emotional for the American team as they saw themselves completing the task that had been begun by the 1938 team almost 40 years earlier. So this is for the Americans, this was them realizing the efforts that had been put in 40 years earlier by those who were trying to climb the mountain. And probably some of those team members would probably still be alive if they hadn't have died in other mountaineering incidences.
Is that what happened?
Well, a lot of mountaineers back then, it's just kind of like, you didn't get up that mountain, right, I'm just going to go climb this mountain. It was like a full-time profession.
Yeah.
They just rumbled between mountains, and every now and again one would fall off a glacier, and that'll be the end of them. So, a few, firsts. So, the first climber to reach the summit of K2 twice was a Czechoslovakian man. He was a member of the 1983 Italian expedition, which made the second successful attempt across the North Ridge, the one we talked about earlier. 3 years later, he summited again via the Aberystwyth Spur, which is the most common way to go. The first woman to summit K2 was a Polish climber called Wanda. She summited in 1986. She also went up with someone called Liliane and Maurice Barrard, who summited later that day but fell during the descent. Liliane Barrard's body was found on the 19th of July, 1986 at the foot of the south face. Yeah.
God, that's sad.
Do you remember I told you about the Everest, where they were talking about the different ways that people fall off the mountain?
Go on.
So there's like a ridge, and if you fall to the left, you fall into Nepal, and it's 10,000 meters. And if you fall off to the right, you fall into China, and it's like 12,000 meters. So you want to fall into China because you'll live longer, because those extra 2,000 meters of falling,
dear me,
gives you a few extra seconds.
You live a bit longer, around 2,000 meters longer.
Yeah, you live 2,000 meters longer. So in 2004, a Spanish climber called Carlos Fontan became the oldest ever person to summit K2. How old do you think he was?
Oldest, 46?
65.
65?
He could have got there with his Freedom Bus Pass, because you get that when you get to 60.
My grandpa Norman couldn't do that.
Yeah. No, your grandpa Norman's 65.
I don't know how old he is, but he's old. Hey, Norman.
So, despite several attempts in 2010, no one manages to reach the summit. In 2010, Fredrik Eriksson intended to ski from the summit, and he was going to be joined by Geraldine Katlenbrunner. But he fell 1,000 meters and was killed. So no skiing from the summit that year. But
God.
I kind of precluded that due to the fact no one summited in 2010.
Yeah. I was waiting for the untimely end.
Yeah, so Katlenbrunner aborted her summit attempt and just was like, not
Thought
the
it best
year.
not to.
So the next year, Katlenbrunner's back. She became the first woman to complete all 14 8,000ers without supplemental oxygen. So she has climbed
What a feat.
14 of the tallest mountains in the world without oxygen, which is very difficult.
Extremely
People
difficult.
die on the way up and down with oxygen. So doing it without oxygen, it takes a real toll on your body.
Wow.
So, 2012. A Russian team aimed for the first winter ascent. So we already mentioned the fact that most ascents only happen between July and August during the best weather conditions. So they thought, you know what? We're going to try another first, because they love firsts. We're going to try and do it in winter. Didn't work. Ended in the death of one of the team members due to frostbite and pneumonia. So the Russian team decided just to go ahead and cancel the descent. So this season, though, other than the winter going badly, the summer season went surprisingly well. A record 26 climbers summited in a single day, bringing the total of the year to 30. The majority of people summited in one day. This is because of the window. You take 3 months trekking out there, a month acclimatizing at the bottom, and you literally only have a window of about 5 days to climb it. These climbers literally give up months or years of their lives for one shot at climbing this mountain.
Yeah.
So I think that's why almost some of they call it what's it called? It's something like summit hunger, or like basically where that you get so fixated on summiting, you've just spent months and months away from your family, and you almost feel like a failure if you don't come back without the summit.
Yeah.
So people push themselves into unsafe situations just to summit.
I can see why.
For a lot of people, if this isn't your profession, if you're not a professional climber, if you're not sponsored by people to climb, you can't just take a year off from work to go climb it again because you failed this year.
You've got to have a bit of wealth to be able to do it.
Or you've got to be funded by a company. Like Red Bull fund loads of these.
All right, okay.
A lot of like climbing companies like Osprey.
Okay.
Like high level where you want to be the company that's had your tent sitting at Camp 4 and K2.
Trespass, if you're listening, fund us. We'll go. Sure.
Like, that's what I mean. Like, they'll fund it because they'll be like, you know what? We used our stuff to get them up that mountain. Like, what's a better, like...
It's a great marketing deal, isn't it?
Marketing thing to have your jacket standing at the second highest point in Earth.
Yeah.
So that's where a lot of it comes from. But you've got to grind the climbing circuit to get to the point where you're going to be paid to go up these mountains. A lot of people just pay themselves because it's just a personal, like, love.
With the summit hunger as well. Just imagine you've spent all these months to, like, get to the summit, and then you get there, and then you've got to go all the way back down again.
Well, that's the thing. Most people die on the way down.
Oh.
Yeah. So let's get back to it. On the 31st of July 2014, Boyan Petrov completed the first Bulgarian ascent. So Boyan is special for a specific reason. So he is one of the very few climbers who climbs without supplemental oxygen, and he also has diabetes.
Wow, okay.
So obviously when you have diabetes, type 1 or type 2, it's a problem with your blood sugar being controlled, isn't it? So when you get into this death zone, when you get above 7,000 meters, all of the cells in your body are screaming for oxygen. You fatigue incredibly quickly. Now, if you have a glucose, like, you know, a glucose deficiency or a problem with your body where you're not using glucose properly, that's going to make it 10 times harder.
Yeah.
So hats off to you.
Wow. Very, very risky.
Hats off to you. Yeah. So 2017, the year of the women. So the first British and American women summit K2.
Wow, brilliant.
And the oldest woman. They thought, we'll go American, British, oldest, all in one.
All these first.
Let's wipe
Get
it
them
out.
all. Tick those boxes.
So she was 52.
52 is a great age.
It is. I mean, what a midlife crisis.
I know.
Probably not a crisis. She's probably been doing this for a while. So 2018 becomes the first person to ski from summit to base camp. So finally he did it.
And they survived.
2010, the guy fell off the mountain. 8 years later, he's done it.
Brilliant
We're
stuff.
good. We're good to go. So let's talk more about these winter expeditions and how they failed. Because winter expeditions, we've been trying to do them for a while. Because like I say, everyone wants a first. The 1987 to 1988. So we've got a Polish, Canadian, British expedition. Loads of Polish climbers, you know.
Oh, really?
Like, Britain isn't overly represented in a lot of these climbing things. It's a lot of like Polish, Norway, Czech. I don't know whether it's because they come from colder climates, but it seems like British people are represented, but like it's a lot of like Polish climbers when you like read into the background of like who summited these mountains. Like they've got a lot of
hats
firsts.
off to the Polish and Czech climbers of the world.
Go for them. So it consisted of 13 Poles, 7 Canadians and 4 British people. They established Camp 3 at 7,300 meters above sea level.
Right.
Then they got hit by hurricane winds, frostbite, forced them to retreat. Failed.
Yeah.
2002, 2003. Got to Camp 4, failed due to the destruction of a tent by harsh weather conditions.
Oh God.
Yeah.
Destruction.
Yeah, so the wind just ripped the tent apart.
God.
So they were like, damn, we have to go back down.
It's like, oh, well, I was looking forward to that PG Tips brew in the tent later on.
Yeah, no. 2011, 2012. Once again, we had to retreat due to hurricane-forced winds as well as frostbite on both hands of one of the team members. So after their descent to base camp, an unsuccessful call for rescue for the man whose both hands had been frostbitten. The helicopter couldn't reach them. The weather got worse, and he died of pneumonia and cardiac arrest.
God.
Following the incident, the expedition was called off, obviously. His hands have fallen off practically, and he's just had a cardiac arrest. You're not going to be like, got a spare hour.
Yeah.
Should we go up? No.
Got a spare hour.
2017, 2018. Still didn't make it.
Right.
Still didn't make it. This brings us to 2021. So you might have seen this in the news. I saw it in the news. I didn't quite understand like the gravity of it, now knowing about all the history as to how long we've been trying to get up there. 10 climbers, international expedition, made the first winter summit on January 16th, 2021. What a good way to round off a bad year.
Yeah.
2020 sucked.
A bit of brightness
We're
for all
going
the
to
darkness.
summit a mountain. Just to think, during that whole pandemic, they were just trekking their way through the Chinese, Pakistani.
It's strange as well because
Yeah.
you can't exactly get a decent phone signal, can you?
Yeah.
Oh, can you? Oh, I'd have thought, for some reason, I'd have just thought that You can't really
They
check
do
your
now.
Facebook messages.
Well, not Facebook, but you can get phone.
They might miss out on like important news things, and maybe they come back down and like they made a vaccine.
Yeah. So the group all summited together. So I showed you the video, didn't I? It's very poignant. If
To
anyone
everyone
wants to watch
listening, you should search. What would the cadets have to search on YouTube?
Just search 2021 K2 Summit, because I think it's only been summited once.
It's a
so
gorgeous
far.
video.
So it's basically this group of men, 5 of them that actually managed to get to the summit. They were all indigenous climbers from Nepal. They all walked hand in hand singing the Nepalese national anthem, and one of them actually managed to get up there without supplemental oxygen.
Wow.
Yeah, and they're walking in like a perfect straight line so that none of them are the first to stand there, because they've done it as a team, which is throwing a bit of shade back at our Italian
Back at the
men.
1954 expedition.
Yeah.
Was it? Yeah.
Who left them for dead because
Well, I
he wanted
don't
to be
blame.
the
I
first
think
one.
too right.
You know, it's these Nepalese climbers that have done it in the winter, have like banded together and have walked up there foot by foot together.
First of all, they did it in the winter.
Yeah. So
Second of all, they did it respectfully.
Yeah, no one could claim it.
Yeah.
Respect.
Props to them.
Respect the mountain. So the summit temperature was -40. So on the same day, a Spanish team member died on the descent from Camp 3. He fell somewhere between Camp 1 and Advanced Base Camp. So there were other people on the mountain that day. And,
Yeah.
this does kind of lead us on to the 2008 K2 disaster.
This doesn't sound good.
It's not good. So,
There's no walking hand in hand on this one.
well, there was for a bit, but not for long.
Oh, God.
Yeah, so the K2 disaster occurred on the 1st of August 2008, when 25 went up and 11 mountaineers died. So 25 up and 11 died. Yeah. So 3 others were seriously injured, but ultimately 11 did pass away from their injuries.
Yeah.
The series of deaths over the course of the Friday ascent and the Saturday descent was the single worst incident in the history of K2 mountaineering, which I suppose is good. No more than 11 people have died, but 11 people between like just over 24 hours is a lot.
I mean, one is enough, you know?
So some of the specific details remain unclear, mainly because a lot of them were suffering from hypoxia. The people who were watching from down at the mountain, obviously it's like watching like ants on a hill, like you can't really see it, and a lot of this stuff happened at night when even the people on the base of the mountain couldn't see anything.
Mm-hmm.
So they've had a quite large investigation as to see what happened, and enough survivors and eyewitness accounts and radio communications have linked up so we have a basic understanding as to what happened on K2 that day.
Mm-hmm.
So the main problem was reported as an ice avalanche occurring as what's known as the bottleneck.
Mm-hmm.
So it is what it sounds like. It's a bit of the mountain where it opens up to being quite wide to then narrows up. So when you have climbers going up, everything slows down. Because
So if it's a busy day, there would basically be a queue for you to get past this certain
bottlenecking.
point. Right, okay.
Yeah, it's like when you go to like a concert and there's like loads of you waiting outside and you've all got to get through the same turnstile. Like that's what
Okay,
the
right,
bottleneck
yeah.
is.
That's a good way to describe
So
it.
that slide destroyed a lot of the climbers' rope lines. So if that hadn't happened, there probably wouldn't have been as many deaths. However, there were 2 climbers that died on the way up prior to the avalanche. So whether that ice fall had happened or not, 2 people would have died, but it probably wouldn't have been 11. Yeah. So among the dead were people from France, Ireland, Korea, Nepal, Norway, Pakistan, and Serbia. So we're going to go through the day in like a timeline and like as the incidents happen.
Mm-hmm.
So Friday the 1st of August. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the initial delays. So the high altitude porters, otherwise known as HAPs, that's what we're going to call them now, and Sherpas, who are people indigenous to the area who are used to the climate, used to the altitude, so they don't tend to get altitude sickness as much as like us that come from like lower areas.
Yeah.
So they started to prepare the lines before midnight. They were joined by a Spanish solo climber called Alberto Zeran, who had come down from Camp 3 during the night and had decided to push early rather than stay at Camp 4. So he decided, I'm just going to go ahead and like
Probably had summit hunger.
speed ahead. Yeah. So the most experienced high altitude porter had to go back down as he had symptoms of high altitude sickness. So he's the leader. His experience was sorely missed. He was the only high altitude porter of the team there that had ever summited K2.
Yeah.
So you've got a lot of high altitude porters who, although have been in the area, don't have the understanding and knowledge that he had of the mountain.
Yeah.
So the climbers, the head of each team, obviously they have to make a plan as to what's happening. Now, there's been a Norwegian team who has been here for quite a while. They've been going up and down the mountain over the past month, setting the ropes, setting the lines, because this is what people don't realize, I think, is when you get there, you don't just walk up and down it in one hit. You spend months there walking up and down and up and down and up and down, like fixing ropes and fixing lines. So when this very experienced high altitude porter had to go, all of the teams that were there had to make plans as to what they were going to be doing.
Probably threw them a bit.
Yeah, because they thought, well, he's going to go up and fix the ropes, and it didn't happen anymore. So what they did is they handed over responsibility to a Korean, the lead of the Korean climb. Now, he wasn't going up the mountain with them, but he was like the leader of the team that was there. So you normally have one person from each team on the base who sits there, looks after the team, is in a safe spot, like a lifeguard at a pool.
Yeah.
They sit at the bottom of the mountain and take any radio signals and make sure everything's going right. So they gave him the responsibility of checking the ropes were correct.
Yeah.
So the morning comes when everyone's meant to be setting off. The Korean team decided that every team would send off their strongest climbers first, because then there wouldn't be like a slowing down situation. So the morning comes and the Korean team haven't set off yet. They planned to set off, they hadn't set off. So the other teams were starting to get frustrated at the fact that these other teams hadn't set off yet.
Yeah.
Then when they go to set off, they find that the ropes have been either placed too far down the slope or just aren't where they need to be. So apparently the ropes were just starting like literally 100 meters from camp. And they were finishing once they got to the difficult bit, there were then no ropes there.
Okay.
So the climbers start to walk up. They found that they couldn't go any further. So everything stops. They had to take the rope from further down the hill and start pushing it back up to prepare the lines. So now suddenly you've got a delay from the fact that people weren't ready. You've got lines that were in the wrong place. And now you have people having to thread their own lines up the mountain.
Yeah.
And in a area where timing is incredibly important, this is obviously not great. And the Norwegian team were very angry about this because they'd spent lots of time threading all these anchor points correctly and they've been set up incorrectly, basically.
Yeah.
So at this point, Eric Meyer decided to abort his attempt and just return back to Camp 4. He was like, this is not safe because with this delay, a lot of us are going to get to the mountain we're not going to be able to summit in time, so I'm heading back.
Probably a good move.
Yeah.
At this point, yeah.
So, and he thought, actually, there's a lot of people up at this bottleneck, and if ice was to fall, it's going to wipe them all out, so I'm not even going to bother. So a few others pushed for a few more hours just before giving up, and there are a few other team members who are suffering with frozen feet because they've been standing still so long. That's one of the major things, is like, you need to keep moving, you need to keep walking, because otherwise you get cold. You can't be standing outside in a queue.
Yeah.
You just get frozen feet. So that was the first incident, which then led on to a lot of the other incidents that we have.
Yeah.
So the first two deaths. So we've got the Mandik and the Bag fall. So one man named Mandik, one man named Bag. So it's 8 a.m. The climbers were finally getting through the bottleneck. So we'd sorted out the rope issues. So Mandik from the Serbian team decided to unclip himself from the fixed rope to attend to his oxygen system. So something was annoying him with his oxygen, so we thought, let's have a little fill with this. He then decides to pass Skog, who is a Norwegian climber. So he decided to do this on what I can only describe as if you were to be walking along a banister. Like, you know the banister at home on your stairs? So he decided, what I'm going to do is I'm going to unclip myself and kind of like walk around her by, like going round literally with his arms on one side of her and coming the other way. Does that seem safe?
No.
So what happened? He bumped and fell. So Skog was okay because she was clipped on. So she fell and just kind of like dangling off, what is now where there's nothing there. But Mandik, on the other hand, fell over 100 meters down the bottleneck. So he just slid for 100 meters down because he decided to unclip himself and trying to get past her. Not a great idea. So some of the climbers at Camp 4 claimed they could see that he was still moving after the fall. So obviously they sent a recovery group to try and get him.
Yeah.
So when they got there, they found no pulse, and judging by the severity of his injuries, they just pronounced him dead right there and then.
Right, okay.
So they said there probably was a likelihood that he probably did move, probably had like an initial adrenaline rush, got up and was like, I'm fine, and then just collapsed.
Can
again.
that happen that
Well,
extremely?
yeah. Have you never seen like people in like car, or not never seen, have you ever heard of people in car crashes where they'll be like, they'll have like broken legs, but they'll like get out of the car and like walk to the grass on the other side and be fine.
No.
Yeah. With adrenaline, you can do a lot. Like mums can like pull their babies out of like under
I've
a
heard
car.
about that,
It's
yeah.
just a surge of adrenaline. It's like when you don't realize that you're hurt because the adrenaline's so high,
And
then
you
you're
peak and then you
like,
trough.
and then you're like, oh, ouch.
Yeah.
So, the Serbian climbers decide to descend the body back into Camp 4. So they put him on like a little sledge. They have like, have you ever seen someone that like walks lots of dogs? Where they have those like harnesses that come
Like a
from
belt.
their waist.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they've got him like that, and they're kind of walking behind him and kind of slowly trudging down the mountain with Mandik's body in front, kind of going down like a sled.
Mm-hmm.
So Bag had come to help them. He was part of the team of the porters that were at the bottom of the mountain that had come up to help.
Yeah.
So a lot of people thought he was suffering from high altitude sickness because he displayed a lot of questionable behaviour. He'd abseiled down the bottleneck for some reason. He was incoherent. He was offering to help. Then he refused to help. And then moments later, he came back to help him again.
Mm-hmm.
So he was clearly confused. As they were trying to bring this body back down, Bag was like bumping into the other members, and they were having to tell him like, you need to be careful, because if they all fell over, you've got a body strapped to you, just gonna whoosh down the hill. So at one point he does fall. They're all trying, the three other members obviously have Mandik's body attached to them, which is pulling them down, and now Bag's body as he's slipped over. They're telling him, unclip yourself from the rope, you're going to drag us down with you. He finally unclips himself from the rope, but he did not try any attempt to stop himself from sliding. So there's this self-arrest position that you can use. Works 50% of the time. He didn't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
He slid down like a starfish. And he fell to his death. No one knows why.
Could be like a delirium induced
Could be delirium.
by hypoxia.
Yeah, but he literally just unclips himself and slides off the edge of the mountain. So that's 2 dead. And at this point, they decide they need to descend without Mandik's body. Because after you've just seen one person slide off down the mountain, they're not gonna bother. So they aborted the mission to bring his body down. They wrapped it in a flag. They fastened him to the mountain, and they started to descend.
Mm-hmm.
So those delays, together with the traffic jam in the bottleneck, resulted in most climbers reaching the summit much later than planned. Some as late as 8 p.m.
And when should they have been there?
Normally, you should be there between 3 and 5. So almost 3 hours later.
A little bit late.
When you're climbing the most difficult mountain in the world.
To be there in the dark
and
as well.
going up is sometimes easier than going down.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like easier to like, you ever like climbed up a rock and you're like, oh, this is all right. And then you get to the top and you're like, how many are
And
down?
you're like, okay,
Yeah.
so.
It's not as easy to like lower weight, is it?
Plus, you can't even see the view at the top.
No.
So what's the point?
So altogether, 18 people summited that day. Although 8 plus 1 who stopped just before the summit wouldn't survive. Yeah. So the first Serac fall. So a Serac fall is basically like an avalanche but of ice.
Mm-hmm.
So by 8:30, darkness had completely enveloped K2. Members of the Norwegian team, including Nessa and Skog, had almost navigated the traverse leading to the bottleneck. So by traverse, I literally mean like a traverse. If you imagine like your the skirting board of your house and you having to hold onto a wall, that's practically how flat it is. They're walking against like a flat wall, shuffling along when a serac, so this large block of glacial ice, slides and just breaks down from above. As it falls, it cuts all the fixed lines, and it takes Skog's husband, whose name was Rolf Bay, with it. So Rolf was the one who had abandoned the ascent only 100 meters below the summit. So basically, he got there and said, I'm just too tired. You go ahead. You guys summit.
He was the man who had the bivouac.
No.
100 odd meters from the summit.
No.
All right, okay.
That was like in 2003.
All right, okay, sorry, yeah.
So this is, we haven't reached darkness yet. No one's bivouacked yet.
Okay.
So he had climbed up nearly 100 meters from the summit. He says, I'm too tired. Nessa, Skog, you go ahead.
Okay.
I'll wait for you on the way back. Nessa and Skog get up to the top. They take photos for like a couple of minutes and they head straight back down because they know that the sunlight's leaving, basically.
Okay. Yeah.
As they get down, they're all descending together. Just before they were traversing this, Nessa had said, "Do you want me to go first?" And Rolf had said, "No, you look after my wife, I'll go first." And ultimately that's what got him killed. If Nessa had gone first, then Nessa would have been killed, basically. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So Nessa and Skog continued descending without the fixed lines and managed to reach Camp 4 during the night. Can you imagine your husband has just been like ripped off the mountain by a massive piece of ice,
and you have to
and
keep
you
going?
have to climb down?
You've got no choice.
Yeah. With now no ropes. Like, you've got no ropes to help you get down. And the light is leaving. Like, that is horrific.
Terrifying.
So that's death 3
Yeah.
that we've had so far. As a result of the Serac fall, the descent through the bottleneck became more technical. So now you've got chunks of ice scattered around. You've got rock. It all looks different. All of your lines have been swept away. You've got no clue.
It's like another mountain.
Yeah, you've got no clue where you're going. And you've got loads of mountaineers that are stranded in the death zone above 8,000 meters. So since the climbers had planned for the fixed lines, they weren't carrying additional ropes or full protection devices. This caused all the climbers to free solo their descents. So as they tried to descend into darkness, some of them carried on, some of them just decided to bivouac until the morning, which makes sense because 3 of them, who we'll talk about later, just thought they couldn't find the ropes. They were like, right, we'll sit here, first bit of light, we're going to get up and find the ropes. Whereas others knew what had happened to the ropes, so just carried on going down. Meanwhile, the Norwegian team, so this is Van de Gevel and de Orbray, had each decided to maneuver the bottleneck in the dark. So they just decided, we're going to have to go for it. So as Van de Gevel reached the bottom of the bottleneck, he witnessed a climber falling to his death. A story that cooperated with the 2 Sherpas who had also witnessed 1 or 2 objects falling from the mountain. So this climber was probably de Orbray, who Van de Gevel had passed just above the bottleneck in the dark. So what happened was, he was like, you go ahead. Like, de Orbray was like, you go ahead, you're going to be quicker than me, I'm too tired. And as de Orbray's just, tip-tapping down the mountain, he just sees something go past him.
Yeah.
Like, he doesn't even have enough time to compute what it is. He just feels like a wind go past him and a light disappear. So someone just slides straight past him, and he knows that was him. So de Orbray had run out of bottled oxygen hours before, and like I said, when Van de Gevel passed him, he knew that he was really tired, and that's why de Orbray insisted that he descended before him, because he didn't want to feel rushed.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's just, poor Van de Gevel's just climbing down, and then he just sees like something just slide past him, and he knows that that's probably the man that he's just been past, because they are literally climbing down like basically a sheer ice wall. They're just literally clipping down with their ice clips like that.
Yeah.
So literally someone would just shoot down.
Yeah.
You'd have no chance of stopping them. Yeah. So the people that I talked about previously. So this is the so we've got 3 people that I said bivouac, didn't I, above the 8,000 meter point.
Yeah.
So we've got Italian semi-soloist Marco, and we've got Van Rugen and an Irishman called McDonnell. So they bivouacked just above the traverse because they couldn't find the fixed ropes leading to the traverse. So Marco previously had some issues the night before. His tent had been completely blown away in the middle of the night, and he had to climb into McDonald and Van Rugen's tent. Van Rugen didn't want him to summit. He said, we cannot take you on as a liability. None of them had slept. They were all really annoyed at him, but to be fair, it wasn't his fault that his tent had got blown away.
Yeah.
But I think if you've been putting all of your life into this for so long, you would just be like, oh, I want to go.
Yeah.
So they all make their way out. They make their bed down. So during that bivouac, they say they heard screams and saw headlights disappear after a roaring sound came. So that makes sense. You've got the Serac coming down. You've got the light of Skog's husband, Ralph Bay, that disappearing. And then you've also got the other light of de Orbray coming down as well.
Yeah.
So that's where the story's kind of like.
Yeah.
So we kind of know what happens.
Yeah.
So at this point, 8 people were still above the bottleneck. So we're moving on. Saturday, we're on the new day. Those of them that bivouacked out have survived the night.
Yeah.
So the rescue effort started at base camp as the group was sent upwards with ropes to help those still stuck in the bottleneck.
Mm-hmm.
The group included Sherpas who went on to search for their relative whose name was Jamek. So some of these Sherpas were actually forced up the mountain because, I mean, they don't have the greatest human rights out there. And basically, if you were a Sherpa belonging to some of these expedition leads, they paid you, they owned you, you were going up that mountain whether you liked it or not.
God.
So they were saying, it's too unsafe, I don't want to go up, I don't want to go up. And they were like, up you go, we need to get these people down. But they didn't want to go up.
People assume that slavery is a historical event, but it happens today.
Yeah.
Modern slavery.
Yeah. So Jamek, who had been stranded with the remaining climbers of the Korean expedition somewhere above the bottleneck. So
How high up was the bottleneck again?
It's around 7... It's just around the 8,000 meter mark.
Okay.
Yeah. So, the second Serac fall. So, early in the morning, above the traverse, Van Rooyen gave up the search for fixed ropes. So he'd woken up with MacDonald and Marco and just been like, there is no ropes, we're just going to have to go down.
Mm-hmm.
So at this point, his vision was deteriorating, he was going snowblind, so he knew he needed to get off the mountain basically right then and then. Like, he basically came with the agreement that if he fell off this mountain, he was going to fall off the mountain, but otherwise he was going to sit there and die because he wasn't going to be able to see.
Mm-hmm.
So he was taking any vision that he had at that point just to try and get him down the mountain.
Yeah.
So Marco and MacDonald didn't follow him immediately because they thought there might still be a chance to be able to find some of these ropes.
Mm-hmm.
So some sources mention only 2 Koreans and Jamek, where there's others indicate that there were 3 Koreans, 1 near death, in what we'll discuss now.
Yeah.
So the men were tangled in several ropes that had clearly been hanging upside down, bloodied throughout the night. So what probably happened was they were attached to the rope when the Serac came through and cut the rope, and they just swung and were bounced against the mountain and were just hanging there because they couldn't get out because it was so steep.
Yeah.
So it was unclear whether the men were victims of that Serac fall or an avalanche or like
a combination of the
or
two.
they just fell and got tangled in the ropes, but they're pretty sure that it was probably the Serac fall that got them. So this also obviously corroborates with what Marco had witnessed in the bivouac the previous night when he saw the loud like whoosh, and then the lights disappearing. So Van Rooyen, who was the man who had the snow blindness who descended before them, he'd come past them. They're basically all coming down the same route, even though there's no fixed lines, because the fixed lines basically go the only way you can climb down the mountain.
Yeah.
So he sees them and he basically thinks, I'm in such bad shape, there's no way I'm going to be able to help these 3 men. Jamek is like kind of awake and he basically just whispers like gloves, and he gloves because he didn't have any gloves on. So Van Rooyen manages to give him his spare pair of gloves but wasn't able to help him anymore. Like, he was becoming delusional from hypoxia, he was going blind, there was no way he was going to be able to help these men. He
would be killing himself potentially if he helped these men, which is the sad truth.
Yeah. Basically. So Marco and MacDonald reached the Korean group later in the morning. So after they've realised they couldn't find the ropes, they realised they were just going to have to come down. So they worked for several hours trying to free them, but there's like no one really knows what happened. So Marco claims that MacDonald, after working with him for about an hour and a half, suddenly climbed back up the mountain, leaving him stranded with the 3 men. So Marco assumed that MacDonald had just succumbed to high altitude sickness and was growing delusional, believing that he was climbing up the mountain again. So he believed he thought he had to climb back up the mountain. So left alone, Marco did all he could for Jamek, giving him some of his own equipment. They'd managed to get the Koreans back into a comfortable position, so they weren't upside down anymore. They weren't face down in the snow. But they were still entangled. Like, with the angle they were at and the fact that the rope they needed was attached further up, they basically couldn't get them out. So Marco, having spent at least 3 hours with the men, was exhausted and just continued to go back down. So Van Rooyen disputes this. So the guy that had the snow blindness that climbed down before, he said that he'd seen them both helping the stranded Koreans from below and thinks that MacDonald did not climb back up the mountain, but instead climbed to the highest anchoring point, trying to cut them free.
Right, okay.
Basically. Then,
so that he wasn't delusional, he was doing that strategically.
Yeah, actually, he was just climbing up the mountain because he was like, right, they're attached here. We need to try and unattach them from here. And then he could have returned to the men and spent many hours freeing them once Marco had left to continue the descent. So, the third Serac fall, an avalanche. So, Marco stated that sometime after he left the 3 men, an avalanche struck just feet away from him. So slid right down past him.
Yeah.
So in the rumble of this avalanche, he spotted the remains of a climber. After investigating them, he concluded that these were MacDonald's remains.
Right.
So he thought, right, MacDonald was above, the avalanche must have come from above, and it must have swept him away. So just after noon, Sherpas looking for their relatives found Marco crawling on his hands and knees. So he was just so tired, he was just like basically crawling around.
Yeah.
The 2 Sherpas radioed to Van de Gevel to come up for Marco. So he was the one that had made it down successfully previously.
Yeah.
The Sherpas received a radio message saying the Koreans were freed, but that a 4th climber descending behind the 2 Koreans and the Sherpas had been swept away by the Sarak Fall and died. So that makes sense with what we knew. There were the Sherpas that had gone up to help. We knew there were some Korean climbers that were stuck, and we also know that MacDonald was somewhere around trying to help them at the same time.
Yeah.
So the description of the climber's red and black suit matched MacDonald's, which suggested that Marco was mistaken in identifying the remains in the avalanche, and supports Van Rugen's theory that MacDonald freed the Koreans before the avalanche killed them.
Right.
So because when this avalanche happened, Marco was crawling around on the floor, there was no way that MacDonald could have been killed in it.
Yeah.
He must have identified basically someone else. They identified him because he had a red and black jumpsuit on.
Yeah.
But that was basically all they know. So now we've got the 4th Sarak Fall and the avalanche. So far we've had...
They never end.
No, so we've got, if we like recount as to where we've got so far, we've got the man that unclipped himself and accidentally fell off. We've got Bag, who unclipped him, fell off the mountain whilst trying to save him. We've had Rolf Bay, who fell off in the 1st Sarak Fall, and now we've had the Koreans and MacDonald, who have also died in that as well.
Yeah.
So minutes after the Sherpas had radioed the news that they had found his relative Jamik and 2 other Koreans, the avalanche or Sarak Fall struck. So they were like, hey, we found them. Whoosh.
Oh.
It swept away the 4 men. So Boat, who had climbed more slowly than his fellow rescuers, didn't get hit. So he was climbing up more slowly, so it basically just didn't reach him. And Marco survived as well because he was at the bottom of the bottleneck.
Right, okay.
So they saw Marco crawling around. Some of them carried on going up, but because Marco was closer to the bottom, it just didn't hit him either. So the death toll had now risen to 11. So meanwhile, Van Rugen, the guy that had the snow blindness, was still making his way down the mountain alone. He's managed to evade like 4 Sarak Falls and an avalanche at this point. He would ultimately have to spend another night out on the mountain, like bivouacking out. He suffered 3rd-degree frostbite to his feet, and he is one of the only people to survive 2 days in the 8,000 meter death zone.
Wow.
Yeah, so he survived.
What a lucky man.
That's literally what he said. He was like, there is no reason why I'm alive and these people aren't. It is pure random luck. Yeah. There is no reason why he shouldn't have been swept away by an avalanche. There's no reason why he shouldn't have died of frostbite. It is just pure.
One of those things.
Yeah. So then the evacuation. So the next day, Van de Gevel and Van Rugen were evacuated from base camp by a helicopter. The Pakistani authorities released a list of those who had been killed on the mountain. The news was quite slow to get through because they were having to send out all these rescue parties.
Yeah.
And Marco was evacuated by helicopter the following day. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Tragic.
It is. So there was a lot of like media around this when it first came out, because obviously 11 people dying on a mountain. There was a lot of negative media about climbers saying, oh, they were so selfish, like why would this many people die just trying to climb a mountain? But there's a very good documentary called The Summit, and if you can find it on the internet, feel free to watch it.
Sergeant White has already briefed me on how difficult it was to find this one documentary called The Summit, because a lot of mountaineering documentaries are called The Summit or
But it
Summit.
wasn't even that. It isn't hard to find. It's hard to buy or rent or watch legally. So if you do want to watch it illegally, there'll be ways. But it is a really good documentary, and it really does show, like, better than I can describe, the steepness of this mountain and how people were just falling off it. Because when I thought, oh, he unclipped himself and slid back down, I was thinking like a little hill. But when you see it, it's like a sheer cliff face.
Yeah,
it's like someone clipping themselves off the White Cliffs of Dover and sliding down that.
You do think of it as a hill, don't you?
It is
in your head.
so steep, like so ridiculously steep. Yeah. You just get a scale of the terrain and the environment. There are a lot of good YouTube videos on K2 as well, if you do want to just have a watch.
I might have a deep dive.
What the people go through to get themselves up that mountain. Because it is pretty, like, intense.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't do it.
Definitely not.
I couldn't even do the level of Call of Duty where you have to ice pick yourself up a hill. But anyway, that was really interesting. Thank you so much for spending the time researching K2 to such an extent. It was really, really fascinating. And thank you to all the Air Cadets for listening. Make sure you follow us on Spotify. We release this podcast every single week, you'll be pleased to hear. And make sure you subscribe to our YouTube, as this podcast streams and premieres every Friday at 7 p.m. But yeah, thank you for listening. Ta-ra.
Bye. Thank you for listening to Got Any Last Words, a weekly podcast for Air Cadets, released every Friday. Got Any Last Words was written, produced, and presented by Sergeant White and CI Me of 361 Gated Squadron. Sound effects by Motion Array. Podcast theme is Grow by KV.